Thank you. Undocumented immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers. These are probably terms that you hear frequently when you watch TV, scroll through social media, or talk with your friends. And while they all relate to immigration, they have vastly different meanings. And yet, people use them interchangeably. What is the difference between these three terms? Well, an undocumented immigrant is a person who lives in a country without proper paperwork. A refugee is a person who is forced to leave their home country to flee natural disasters, wars, or persecution. An asylum seeker is much like a refugee, in that this individual is forced to flee their home country for safety. But unlike a refugee, an asylum seeker's claims have yet to be evaluated by the US government, and as such, they have not been granted the refugee status. According to the Center for Immigration Studies, nearly 60,000 people sought asylum in the United States in 2021. Of the thousands of men, women, and children fleeing for their lives, only 14% were granted asylum in the United States. So what now of the thousands? What now of the thousands that are left stateless or forced to return to their home country? I remember clearly the spring afternoon where I learned that a majority of these rejected asylum seekers were now either missing or dead. They had met the fate from which they were trying to flee. And although the number of asylum seekers that I worked with on the US-Mexican border is small in comparison to these thousands, the news was still just as jarring. I think back to the women and children who I met with in the small, windowless, whitewashed interrogation room. I met the faces of mothers, sisters, abuelitas, children, and even babies. I think back to the horrific stories that I heard in that detention center, often nicknamed the baby jail. Stories of fear, death, and persecution. A lot of the asylum seekers in the detention center didn't know where some of their family members were, as they had been separated from their husbands and sons at the border. And that was, in fact, one of the first questions that I always received was, do you know where my family is? And do you know if they are safe? I did not know. It was in those moments that I wanted nothing more than to wrap my arms around them. But it was forbidden. The most I could do was shake their hand and promise to help them as much as I could. I think back to one moment where a young toddler, sobbing, tired, hungry from the long day, wrapped her arms around my leg. It broke my mama heart to throw my hands up in the air and reassure the security guards that I was in no way comforting or consoling this crying child. It felt shameful. It felt inhuman. And even though I entered that detention center knowing all of the relevant case law and all of the legal jargon, I had to ask myself, am I really being an advocate for these people? I remember all of my clients perfectly, but one that stands out to me is Rosa, whose name and identifying details have been changed. Rosa and I had very similar personalities, and we started our initial meeting by talking about my pink painted nails. It felt a little strange to be talking about something so trivial as a manicure in such a dire situation. And yet, it was so natural for us to have something to connect over, to bond over. In our native Spanish, Rosa told me the story of an abusive boyfriend who was part of an international gang. Because Rosa knew so much about the gang, she was asked to join. And when she said no, her and her boyfriend broke up, and the gang began to target her. Rosa fled from city to city, only further angering this gang, and soon their threats turned to more than just words. They beat her. Fearing for the life of her children, Rosa fled by bus to the US-Mexican border with nothing but a backpack and her kids. When she arrived at the border, she was met with this relief, thinking that she was finally safe. But that relief was only met with further disappointment. when she learned that she would have to wait on the border for an unknown period of time. After many days of waiting in the hot sun, Rosa was taken to a preliminary detention center, sorted, awakened in the middle of the night, and taken to an unmarked van, where she was driven in the dark to the asylum-seeking detention center, surrounded by barbed wire fences and security guards. As mentioned earlier, an asylum seeker is like a refugee, but their claims have yet to be evaluated by the US government. The US evaluates these claims by conducting what is known as a credible fear interview, and it's exactly what it sounds like. An individual sits across from an immigration officer, and that officer proceeds to then ask her a series of questions to determine if the fear for her life is credible or not. Note that passing this interview, known as a positive determination, does not yet mean that you've been granted asylum. Rather, it means that you can now start the long and expensive process of seeking asylum in the United States. Depending on the jurisdiction, less than 15% of people will ever pass their credible fear interview, and even fewer will be granted asylum, as noted by Track Immigration Research. Ultimately, it will be a judge who, after hearing their case, will make the final decision. Which brings me back to Rosa. After sharing the details of her horrific story with a Customs and Border Patrol officer, it was determined that the fear Rosa had for her life and for the life of her children was not credible, and she was promptly deported. I don't know what happened to Rosa, but I do now know what we as community members can do to help asylum seekers like her. We start first by educating and empowering ourselves with the knowledge. We learn the differences between the asylum process and traditional immigration processes. Now, don't get me wrong, we need to continue talking about traditional immigration processes. I myself come from an immigrant mother whose story should be shared, who should be amplified. But the process for obtaining asylum is far different than those who enter this country, whether it be through a family visa or perhaps through employment. And so it is too difficult for us to compare. The first way you can start is by talking to your local representatives. I know immigration law is so complex, and sometimes it feels overwhelming trying to learn and keep up with all of it. Talking to your local representatives is a good way to start. Don't be afraid to ask the difficult questions, like why are there so many people in need who are being turned away at the border? And what policies are you advocating for that would make it safer for asylum seekers? Similarly, our state representatives play an important role in helping asylum seekers after they have been admitted into the United States. You can ask the same questions. What are we doing to make our communities a safer place for asylum seekers? And how do we help those who have just arrived in this country fleeing persecution? The ultimate solution is to support and advocate for policies that are aimed at helping people. Now that we have empowered ourselves with knowledge, we can take the time to listen. I left that detention center with a deep connection to the stories that I had heard. As a lawyer, I've learned how to promote and encourage men, women, and children to share their stories with others. I've taught those in our community how they can create a space for asylum seekers to share their journey. And the best part is, you can do this too. That is how we educate our community. That is how we amplify the voices of the vulnerable. According to the Utah Department of Health and Human Services, in their Office of Refugee Resettlement, there are roughly 60,000 refugees in Utah alone, many of who were once asylum seekers. This number continues to grow every year. Asylum seekers shop at your grocery stores, they live in your neighborhoods, their children go to school with your children. Create a space for them where they can share their life and their story without fear of judgment, bias, or deportation. Create a space and take the initiative to learn of their story rather than make assumptions on how they got here. Now that we have learned, and now that we have listened, we must now speak. We must denounce hateful rhetoric and language from our communities. We must call out our friends and family who refer to human beings as illegal. We must call out friends and family who refer to an influx of immigrants as an invasion, or who find it easier to blame immigrants for their woes. Remember, there are people in our community who are silently listening to you. They're silently listening to what you say and what you don't. There are those in our community who are silently listening to what you post on social media. We must denounce all hateful rhetoric, and we must denounce those who spread xenophobia under the guise of just saying it how it is. No. Being blunt in your bullying is not a badge of honor. We help asylum seekers by taking the time to learn the difference between the asylum process, the refugee process, and traditional immigration processes. We recognize that categorizing individual circumstances is unfair to the individual. And when you hear people who categorize such large groups of people together, ask yourself, what is actually being said here? You don't have to go to law school to help asylum seekers. You don't have to go work on the border. You help asylum seekers by learning. You help asylum seekers by listening and creating a space for them to share their stories. You do so by denouncing hateful rhetoric and speech in our communities. Ultimately, if you want to help, you create a community that is safe for asylum seekers, and even more importantly, a place where they feel wanted. Thank you.